Haidong! So in this video we're going to talk about the figure 8. So if you're not familiar with the figure 8, so from the side it's just going to look like this, right? So again, you might be wondering like, alright, that looks pretty. So what, right? So as I mentioned, you'll be able to use this in combat, at least in a very specific circumstance. But the main thing that I would recommend if you do want to learn this kind of stuff is, again, if you're into the flash, right? So for example, the figure 8 is going to be your gateway to learn the complex figure 8, which is just an extra spin. Complex figure 8 is a nice lead into bigger complexes, which can lead into overhead spins and cuts, stuff like that, right? That was a really terrible cut, but that's the idea, right? So you learn the figure 8. Once you learn the figure 8, you can learn the complex figure 8, and from the complex figure 8, you can spin overhead, cut down, stuff like that. So the figure 8 is kind of, again, the kind of gateway, kind of gets you used to just the sheer momentum of a weapon. Now there is, again, going to be an actual application for this in the future, but if for no other reason, and there usually isn't another reason, this works on, again, flexibility of your wrist, which is really important in swordsmanship, right? So for example, if I'm trying to cut you, and this is kind of the extent of my wrist flexibility, not that impressive, right? Versus if I have a little bit more wrist movement, right, I can actually have a little bit more extension in that cut. Same thing with X and 11 blocks, right? So if you don't have that much flexibility, you might be kind of like, when all you need to do is boom, right? So, stuff like that. So using the figure 8 is a good way to learn how to, first of all, just get used to the weight of your weapon. It gets you used to using a little more of your wrist, right? Now, obviously, you can use bigger muscle groups, but in terms of just aesthetic, and again, this set of videos is going to be called tricking. So in tricking, it's just all about the aesthetic, right? But let's talk about actually learning how to do it. There's going to be at least 2 ways for us to try it. So the first way is just, all right, make a giant X with your sword, right? So you cut it down. So notice I'm actually trying to engage the shoulder just because that's what a swordsman should do, right? So just cut, nice big motion, and make it smaller and smaller, right? So smaller, until you are here, right? Now notice I'm also just using these 2 fingers when I just want it to be flashy, right? Because it's a little bit easier just to move it around. Now what you might have seen as well is there's going to be a difference between a wider figure 8 and a narrower figure 8. So in terms of aesthetics, so if you're trying to do this like in circuits, for example, like in NASCA, you want that narrow one, especially if it's on the horizontal, right? So from the side, this is the wide, right? Versus something a little bit tighter. Now obviously if it's tighter, don't hit yourself, right? Because that would be bad. So one note on learning how to do this stuff. So tricking in general is going to be more dangerous. So what I would recommend, and this is not how I learned it, but after years of hurting myself, I highly recommend a couple things, right? So first, try not to go with the sharp one. This isn't like sharp, but if it goes fast enough, it can cut your lip open and bleed all over your nice blue floor, especially when your instructor is looking at you, trying to hold a conversation, and you're just bleeding. That happened. So, I highly recommend, if this is your first time doing it, use a mukam, boken, something that's not sharp. And ideally also something that's just light, just so you don't, like if you do hit yourself, there's not that mass hitting your elbow. So if it's something light, ideally the balance is actually going pretty close to the middle. So this is actually a tricking sword, so this was designed for this purpose. So that's why I'm not using my my Segum or my Yaito, because it wouldn't work as well. So that said, there's also something that I use when I'm grinding this idea for a while, especially when you start throwing the sword. Yes, I said throwing. And they're, I forget what they're actually called, but more or less if you look for, so in baseball, because that's apparently a thing. There's something you can wear that goes underneath the catcher's glove. It's more or less a thin, almost like a batter's glove, but with reinforced palm protection. So that's something I would recommend if you're learning, especially if you're learning how to throw the weapon. That's not going to stop it from hurting, because it will hurt because you are throwing a weapon in the air and you're trying to catch it. But that said, it will minimize, maybe not minimize, it will reduce some of the pain, especially in your joints. So with those two things, okay, so one more thing. And if you're really unsure about your current abilities, wear some face protection, right, mouth guard, all that kind of stuff. Now obviously for figure eight, I think probably the most probable accident that you're gonna have is maybe like you hit your leg or you hit your, maybe the side of your face. But I'm not expecting it to like gouge out your eyes because the angle will be kind of weird. But that said, if you're unsure about any of this, wear proper protection, wear like chest guard if you're trying to learn something like that. That was a long rant. So let's keep going. So that was one way of learning how to do the figure eight. Right, and the other way is going to be, so think about cutting off your nose and then cutting off your butt. Nose, butt, nose, butt. And this is going to teach you the narrow version, right? Which again is the more aesthetic one. That's one way you can do it. This is actually going to be what I'm going to use to teach you the complex figure eight. So more or less it's just going to be Myanmar, right? But for now, it's like, all right, so it's just like, so cut off your nose, cut off your butt. Nose, butt, and just keep going forward like so. So you might be asking, so far we're cutting down, can we cut up into what's called a backwards figure eight, which is very exciting? And the answer is, of course, yes, right? So backwards figure eight is also a thing, right? So you can learn how to do that in the exact same way, right? So I can cut up, 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 smaller, 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 until you're here. Same thing with the cut off your nose, cut off your butt, just in backwards, so cutting off this way and then cutting off this way, right? So people tend to have more difficulty with the backwards figure eight. So for example, I actually find it to be nicer in terms of like chained weapons, so you think about nunchucks and stuff like that. I'm pretty happy actually with the backwards because you have that extra torque. That said, it does take generally more time for you to get used to this. But yeah, so you can also do a backwards figure eight. So one thing to also keep in mind, so notice I've been using I've been using exclusively the right hand, because that's my dominant hand, right? So that's just what I use when I teach things. But obviously, do both, right? So it'd be good for you to also learn it with the left hand. So notice I'm not quite as up to snuff, right? And you can also go backwards, especially with the backwards one is not my forte on that side. But try both sides, and also both versions of forward and backwards. So now it wouldn't be one of my videos if I didn't take it to an extreme, right? So one more thing you can learn is also do this with both swords, right? So all you want to do is forward figure eights if you want to. So obviously if you want to add a little more flair, you want to be in like a nice deep taito-sei. You can also shift, something like that. If you want to, and this is going to work your brain, I actually haven't done this drill in a very long time, you can try to do one forward, one back. I'm going to do this one forward, forward and backwards, right? And that's going to be really weird. But that is one thing that you can practice. So notice I'm going to start doing some two-sworded stuff, at least in terms of tricking, just because that was something that I actually did some competition with. And also just, it's fun. Having two swords is fun. That's also one way I really like to spar, as my students also know. But speaking of sparring, I mentioned like, oh, yo, you can actually like use this in combat. And so far I've just been like, aha, right? So let's actually see how we can use this in combat. So at least as the way we've learned it, this figure eight is exclusively one-handed. Now obviously you can do two-handed, right? There's nothing that's going to stop you from doing a two-handed figure eight in either direction. But at least in terms of application, I found the most use for it in one-handed sparring. So this is going to. So first of all, this is one of my guards I usually use against my students, and usually when I'm sparring Gumdosa and Kendoka. Right, so this is going to be one of my defenses. So if anyone students who are watching this, they might cringe a little bit. But yeah, so this is one of my defenses. So one thing they can do from this is actually figure eights, right? So from here, so for example, I'm going to use a figure eight to actually kind of hide the direction my sword is going to be coming from, right? So because I'm in this guard, my vitals are further back, my tip is further forward. It puts the other person a little bit at a disadvantage, but obviously I'm at a disadvantage because this has like 60% of the power associated with a two-handed guard. But it's also pretty tricky, as my students will tell you. So for example, what I could do is just roll, cut, and come back. Obviously I can also do a roll, cut, because I might be rolling this way. But yeah, so from this guard, you can actually do, again, a couple different figure eights, right? So you can do figure eight forward, figure eight this way. You can try to do a double figure eight, because kind of just hide where you're coming from. In general, that is one way you can use this guard. But I highly recommend you don't do what I'm about to do in sparring, because you will die. Don't just do this and just be like, right? Because all your opponent needs to do is stab you in the face and you're gone, right? Because the actual figure eight motion, if it gets stopped, you're not in a good position, right? Because this is mostly like one-handed. If I just get blown away this way as I'm coming in, my sword's gone, right? I mean, I'm not gone, but it's at least displaced enough that I'm probably gonna die in the next move. So just moving in this way, a very bad idea, so don't go General Grievous on it. But it does have its uses, right? So just like with chained weapons, right, so soft weapons, the point of the figure eight is actually learning how to regain control of a retracted weapon, right? So if you think about nunchuck, right, so when you strike, it's not gonna be just following through like a sword, it's gonna rebound, right? So using your figure eight, that's kind of how you gain back control. You can also do the same way with your sword, right? So if I'm here, and then like, bang, I'm really embedded, and I'm kind of like either sliding or something like that, I can either roll it back if I need to, I can tuck it back if I need to. Just in general, this is a good way to get back control of your sword. It wouldn't be a sword links video without actually having a drill at the end. So what I would like you to do is, obviously if this is new to you, learn how to do the figure eight, right? So you can do figure eights, you can do backwards figure eights, a lot of fun stuff. And so another drill that you can try is actually again, I don't necessarily recommend learning this guard too much, but just try from, if you want to be in the one-handed defense, so if you're here and just kind of like pivot away a little bit here, all you want to do is just like roll, cut, try rolling this way, cut, just try rolling into a cut. Now you're going to notice it's going to be much, much weaker, but it's going to give you a certain kind of advantage. Also, it's going to let you learn how to, again, rebound from a cut. So again, if you've been sparring, you know that not everything happens the way you want it to. Right? So if I cut this way and I kind of like rebounds off like his shoulder or something like that, or if he deflects it effectively, I need to learn how to come back. Obviously, I can come back this way. I can just roll back if I need to, or roll into a guard. Not the best way, but still a way for you to recover. So try those guys, right? So again, try just basic, like learning it. Also just try spinning into a cut. So with that, so as always, so keep training and stay humble. Haidong!